Hey guys, tonight we slip back into a place you never signed up for, a dusty corner of ancient Mesopotamia where the rivers flood, the clay bakes under the sun, and the locals decide justice not with coins or swords, but with a frothy mug of beer. Yes, beer, arguably the world's oldest happy accident, turned into a legal tender and courtroom ritual. You probably won't survive this kind of legal system today. Imagine being fined 5 gallons of Bud Light for parking in the wrong spot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from and what's the local time? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Go ahead, get comfortable, and let your imagination roam as we continue, sleepless historian of how Sumerians used beer to settle legal disputes. The air around you is heavy with dust, and that faint, malty smell of barley left too long in the sun. Your sandals crunch across the packed earth, and you notice that everywhere you look, someone is carrying a clay jar or stirring a mash of wet grains. You've landed in Sumer, one of the earliest civilizations, somewhere between 4000 and 2000 BCE. People here invented the wheel, writing, and, rather more importantly for tonight's purposes, beer. Not the golden filtered kind you'd see advertised during a sports game. This is thick, porridge-like, cloudy stuff that you'd slurp with a straw. Historians still argue whether it was more like soup or drink, but either way, it was central to life. You pass a wall of clay tablets stacked like heavy books. They glisten faintly in the dim light, each one etched with wedge-shaped cuneiform script. These aren't just grocery lists or hymns to gods. They're court records, receipts, and agreements where beer often plays the starring role. A scribe sits hunched, stylus in hand, scratching out another ruling. He looks half asleep, like a student forced to take minutes at a meeting he doesn't care about. His stylus taps against the clay rhythmically, and you realize justice here is not served cold, it's served foamy. One mainstream fact anchors this scene. The Sumerians used beer as a form of payment, wages, and, yes, fines. Workers on temple projects often received rations of beer instead of coins because silver was rare and barley was abundant. It made sense. Everyone needed food and drink, and this drink was safer than most water supplies. If you argued with a neighbor over a broken wall or a missing goat, the court might decide that the offender owed you a few jars of beer. But then comes the quirky bit. Some of the tablets suggest people spilled beer right on the clay during trials, perhaps as a way of sealing the deal. Imagine going to small claims court today, the judge banging a pint glass instead of a gavel, and then deliberately pouring a splash on the paperwork. Sticky, sure, but memorable. Your gaze shifts to one particular tablet, and you can just make out the lines. A farmer promising another farmer a measure of barley beer every harvest as compensation for irrigation rights. The stylus strokes wobble as if the scribe himself had enjoyed a little too much while writing. Historians still argue whether such contracts were symbolic gestures or legally binding payments. Was the beer consumed on the spot or tallied for later? The debate lingers like foam at the bottom of a cup. You shuffle forward, the heat pressing down like a heavy blanket. In the background, someone laughs loudly, the sound bubbling like fermentation. You catch a whiff of beer again, sour and yeasty, mixing with the river breeze. Your eyes droop slightly as you imagine endless days where every quarrel, from goat theft to land disputes, might end with a transaction in barley brew. It sounds absurd at first, but then again, modern life still trades justice for fines, only now in digits and banknotes rather than frothy jars. As you linger by the clay stacks, one scribe drops his stylus and sighs, muttering something about too many beer cases today. He wipes his brow and leans back, his clay-smeared tunic sticking to his skin. You almost want to tell him that thousands of years later, people will laugh gently about how boring but strangely cozy these records are. But you let him be. He dips his stylus again, ready to inscribe another tiny drama in barley and foam. The day stretches on, and you're lulled by the rhythm, the scratching of clay, the sloshing of beer jars, the murmured negotiations. You feel the world narrowing to a soft hum, like the faint background noise of your fan at home. The disputes, the beer, the clay, they all blend together until it seems like the most natural thing in the world. The sun dips lower over the mud brick walls, and you wander toward a building that smells more like roasted barley than incense. The air grows cooler inside, shaded by woven mats strung across the entry. You realize you've stepped into a tavern, but not just any tavern. In Sumer, this place is equal parts bar, community hall, and, strangely enough, courthouse. You expect rowdy patrons, dice games, maybe a brawl, but instead you find a solemn circle of people with jars of beer at their feet, leaning in as though this is the supreme court of foamy pints. A woman in a long robe pours beer into a large communal pot. She isn't just the hostess. She's presiding like a judge, her ladle as symbolic as any gavel. Everyone waits for their share, but no one drinks yet. They're here to settle a dispute. You slide into a corner, pressing your back against a cool clay wall, and watch the scene unfold. The tavern keeper clears her throat. A farmer accuses his neighbor of stealing a goat, and instead of shouting or demanding silver, he demands restitution measured in beer. The accused shifts uncomfortably, his hands stained with dirt, maybe guilt too. The crowd murmurs, slurping noises bubbling up from the back. And then the ruling begins. No lengthy deliberations, no lawyers in powdered wigs, just a simple negotiation. How many jars of beer will it take to make this right? Here's your mainstream fact. Taverns really were centers of legal and social life in Mesopotamia. They weren't just watering holes. They were where deals were struck, disputes resolved, and punishments agreed upon. Archaeological records even show laws regulating taverns, who could run them, how prices were set, and what punishments befell those who cheated customers. But here's the quirky bit. Instead of scribbling every detail into official court archives, many disputes were simply handled on the spot. If someone owed you beer, you didn't necessarily need a royal decree. You needed the tavern keeper, respected by locals, to enforce it. Imagine taking your landlord and roommate to a Starbucks, plopping down lattes, and asking the barista to arbitrate the rent. The ladle clinks against the pot as the tavern keeper stirs, her eyes narrowing. She announces that the accused must supply 3 jars of beer to be delivered during the next market day. The crowd nods approval, and the tension dissolves like foam sliding off a mug. The goat's fate is forgotten. What matters is that community balance has been restored. Historians still argue whether these tavern-based rulings carried the same weight as formal temple or royal courts. Were they official law or more like socially binding handshake deals? The debate persists because while many tablets preserve contracts written by scribes, the oral agreements in taverns leave only traces, rules about tavern keepers, or warnings about unlicensed arbitration. You shift in your corner, imagining yourself dragged into such a place for a speeding ticket. Instead of a fine mailed to your home, you'd be hauled before a barmaid, ordered to buy 3 pints for the offended party, and sent on your way, possibly tipsy but debt cleared. Not a terrible system, though the Department of Motor Vehicles would never approve. The atmosphere loosens after the ruling. The goat-stealing accusation now resolved, the crowd finally raises their straws and drinks deeply from the frothy communal pot. Foam clings to beards, laughter bubbles up, and you sense the shared relief. Justice isn't about punishment here. It's about rebalancing the community, making sure no one leaves too bitter, except maybe about the hangover tomorrow. You notice the tavern keeper herself taking careful notes on a clay shard, her stylus scratching away between pores. Perhaps she's recording who owes what, or maybe she's writing an IOU disguised as a beer menu. Either way, you're struck by the practical genius of it all. Justice carried out in the same space where people relax, gossip, and eat. No need for marble courthouses when you have clay walls and barley mash. The night deepens and lanterns flicker against the walls, their light soft and hypnotic. The hum of voices blends with the slosh of beer and the tap-tap of styluses. You let your eyelids drift half shut, feeling the rhythm of this ancient system wash over you. People argue, they sip, they reconcile. The tavern breathes like a living courtroom, powered not by laws alone, but by the shared ritual of drinking together. The next morning drags itself into being, sluggish and hot, like a hangover nobody admits to. You step out of the tavern into streets that still smell faintly of spilled beer, mud, and livestock. The town stirs, merchants dragging carts, children darting barefoot, and somewhere nearby you hear the rhythmic chant of brewers tending their vats. The day's disputes will not wait for evening lanterns. They begin now in daylight, with barley measured scoop by scoop. You follow a line of men balancing wide clay jars on their shoulders, each one sweating under the weight of frothy restitution. At the edge of the market square, another small tribunal forms, not in a temple, not in a tavern, but right there in the open air. 2 neighbors argue over irrigation rights, their voices climbing higher than the bleating goats. The solution? Not a coin, not a lash, but precise ladles of beer. Here's the mainstream fact. The Sumerians developed surprisingly detailed systems for measuring beer. They used standardized jars called sila, each about a liter, to ensure fairness. These measures appear again and again on cuneiform tablets, tied to wages, rations, and yes, fines. A worker might earn 2 selah of beer per day. An offender might pay the same in penalty. Precision mattered. No one wanted to be cheated of their barley brew. The quirky bit is how disputes often involved elaborate counting rituals. Imagine a clay jar set between the parties, with each ladle of beer counted aloud, witnesses nodding at every splash. The liquid gurgles, the crowd leans in, and you can almost hear someone mutter, "That's 2, that's 3, don't short me on 4. It turns the legal process into a kind of sleepy drinking game. And yes, it's entirely possible some disputes ended with everyone too tipsy to remember the original quarrel. The argument before you drags on, voices sharp as reeds. One farmer insists his neighbor's canal drained his field, while the neighbor retorts that the floods spared no one. The judge, a rotund elder with hands like clay paddles, waves them both silent and orders beer measured out, 5 selah from the accused to the accuser. The jars are brought forth, ladles dip, foam splashes onto sand, and a scribe scratches the tally onto a damp tablet. Justice clinks and sloshes in real time. Historians still argue whether these measurements were symbolic, meant to demonstrate goodwill, or actually transferred, drunk on the spot, or stored for later. Some tablets suggest immediate consumption. Others mention delivery deadlines. The truth is hazy, like the cloudy beer itself. You smile at the thought, law as a fermentation schedule. Case closed in 7 days once the brew is ready. You lean against a market stall, watching the jars empty. The loser of the dispute looks grim, though not devastated. After all, barley was plentiful, and beer was both sustenance and payment. The winner accepts the ladles with solemn nods, though you notice his grin widening as the count rises. In the background, a boy tries to catch the foam drips in a clay cup, earning a swat on the ear. Some things never change: kids and free samples. If you squint, the scene doesn't look so different from modern times. We count dollars, tally digits, calculate interest, and pretend it's all very advanced. But underneath, the system is the same: numbers, measures, agreements, and the occasional complaint that someone didn't pay their fair share. Only now it's spreadsheets instead of clay tablets, debit cards instead of ladles. Honestly, clay seems more durable. Your banking app crashes faster than a jar shattering on stone. The elder finishes the count. The scribe seals the clay tablet with a final press, and the crowd disperses like barley husks in the wind. The dispute, once heated, now feels as flat as a forgotten cup of beer. The neighbors mutter but walk away side by side, their anger thinned out by ritual and shared acceptance. You can almost sense a collective exhale. The day grows hotter, but the rhythm continues. More jars, more ladles, more scratchings on clay. By mid-afternoon, the whole square hums with the low, drowsy cadence of justice by measure. You let your eyes close for a moment, lulled by the sound of gurgling liquid and the soft tap of styluses, like rain dripping on stone, only slower, heavier, more deliberate. You open your eyes again and realize the square is emptying, disputes settled for now. What lingers is the faint, yeasty tang of beer drying in the sun, the ghost of voices counting, and the gentle absurdity of it all. That fairness here is not sealed with signatures, but with frothy barley breath. and somehow it works. You wander away from the market square, your feet dragging a little in the dust, lulled by the memory of ladles clinking against clay jars. Around a corner, you hear a different kind of scratching, not beer being measured, but styluses rasping over wet tablets. The smell of damp clay and burnt reed tips fills the air. You've stumbled into the scribe's quarter, where justice becomes permanent, not just froth and foam drifting away in conversation. Here, a line of men sit cross-legged, styluses poised like tiny chisels. Each stroke carves wedges into soft clay, locking today's quarrels into eternity. You lean closer to one, and he barely notices you, too busy etching out a contract. His tablet reads something like, 2 jars of beer payable each month in settlement for damage to the field. The handwriting, if you can call cuneiform handwriting, is neat but monotonous, like a bureaucrat's soul etched in triangles. Mainstream fact, Sumerians pioneered written contracts, some of the oldest in the world, and many involve beer. They weren't vague oral promises, they were recorded obligations that could be stored in archives, retrieved years later if anyone disputed the deal. It's a bit like today's court transcripts, though far heavier to carry around. And here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes those clay tablets were so casual they used recycled shards, bits of broken pottery with quick notes scratched on, like sticky notes of the Bronze Age. Imagine someone settling a legal dispute about stolen barley by scribbling an IOU on yesterday's broken cereal bowl. Centuries later, archaeologists dig it up and call it a monumental insight. The tablet you're peering at is damp, the clay yielding under the stylus with soft crunches. A scribe pauses to blow on it, his cheeks puffing like a flute player, then resumes. Another scribe leans over, correcting a wedge, muttering about sloppy handwriting. You almost laugh. Apparently, grammar police existed 5,000 years ago, too. But then you sense the weight of it all. These contracts weren't jokes. They could decide marriages, land ownership, or lifetime debts. Beer was more than refreshment. It was a currency of trust, and these scribes were its accountants. Once the tablet dried in the sun or in a kiln, it was as binding as your signature on a credit card slip. Historians still argue whether everyone trusted these clay records or whether enforcement still relied on social pressure. Did people genuinely march back to the archives, dig out an old tablet, and wave it like evidence? Or was it more symbolic, a way of showing seriousness while the real power lay in community reputation? The truth might be stuck somewhere between clay shards and human gossip. You glance around at stacks of tablets, each one like a frozen voice from the past. Some record wages, 3 selah of beer, 2 loaves of bread. Others are disputes. Compensation agreed, beer delivered after harvest. You imagine future archaeologists finding your grocery receipts and trying to build an entire civilization from them. Clearly, they would say, these people worshipped frozen pizzas and laundry detergent. The day grows hotter, and the scribe's courtyard becomes an oven of baked promises. The clay darkens as it dries, locking each wedge forever. A young apprentice drags a basket of tablets to a corner, stacking them like bricks, his arms trembling from the weight. You almost want to help, but you're too entranced by the sleepy rhythm. Scratch, blow, stack, repeat. One tablet in particular catches your eye. The script wavers, the lines crooked, as though written in haste or under the influence. It records an agreement for a beer payment, but the units are doubled mid-sentence, as if the scribe lost count. Was it a mistake or a deliberate scam? Historians still argue over cases like this, fraud or sloppy writing. Either way, it proves bureaucracy and human error are eternal partners. The afternoon slouches on. The scribes don't rush. They move like people who know time bends around clay, not the other way. Every wedge is deliberate, every pause a breath in history. You realize you could fall asleep right here, head against the warm wall, listening to styluses tapping like distant rain. Somewhere, another scribe chuckles softly, maybe at a joke scratched into a tablet margin. Yes, even here, among contracts and penalties, humor sneaks in. You picture a bored clerk doodling little barley stalks, never guessing his doodle would outlive him by millennia. You step back, the courtyard tilting slightly in your weary vision, and let the steady scratching fade into a lull. Justice has been carved, disputes frozen in clay, and beer, sticky, yeasty beer, remains the thread binding it all together. The afternoon air is heavy now, so thick you feel it clinging to your skin like wet linen. You wander past the scribe's quarter, following the faint slosh of liquid. A small procession of men comes trudging toward the temple gates, clay jars bouncing against their hips. They're not bringing sacrifices of lamb or gold. They're hauling beer. And the mood is not celebratory. It's nervous, subdued, the way people look when their wallets are about to get lighter. You pause by the gate, where a guard with a bronze spear eyes the jars suspiciously, then waves them through. Inside, the smell of incense tangles with the sharp tang of fermenting mash. Here in the temple, you see the other half of the legal system. Punishment and fines, not paid in silver or livestock, but in foamy, heavy liquid. Beer as restitution, beer as apology, beer as the grease that keeps justice moving. Mainstream fact, fines in Sumer were often paid in kind rather than in money. Barley, sheep, or beer could all serve as currency, but beer was especially common because it was both valuable and perishable. It forced quick settlement. No one wanted to wait months for justice when the brew would sour. Here's the quirky tidbit. Sometimes fines weren't delivered as sealed jars, but as fresh rations poured into communal pots at the temple. That meant you could literally watch your punishment being consumed by priests and scribes while you stood there, shame heating your face. It's like paying a parking fine by buying the judge lunch and then watching him eat it right in front of you. You follow the men into a side chamber. There, a priest in linen robes gestures solemnly toward a clay tablet on the floor, inscribed with the details of the penalty. The offender, a lanky man with mud on his tunic, sets down his jars one by one. Each jar lands with a dull thud, a soft slosh. He mutters under his breath, maybe cursing, maybe praying, and the priest nods, unimpressed. The jars are lined up like guilty defendants waiting for judgment. Historians still argue whether these fines were truly punitive or more symbolic, part of restoring balance with the gods. Was beer just an offering passing through human hands to divine ones, Or was it purely practical, ensuring that priests, officials, and record keepers stayed well fed and well drunk? Either way, the offender walks away lighter, both in jars and in pride. You drift toward a corner where another man is negotiating with a scribe. His offense isn't theft or violence, it's shortchanging someone in a beer sale. Apparently, he watered down his brew. The penalty? He owes pure beer, no dilution, twice the original order. You smirk. Imagine a modern bartender caught cutting drinks with too much soda and sentenced to hand over 2 kegs of top-shelf whiskey. Fair, if you ask me. A child scampers in, tugging at his mother's robe, pointing at the line of jars. She hushes him, but you see the gleam in his eyes. Beer as both punishment and treat, something he won't taste for years. You remember how earlier in the marketplace, kids tried to lap up foam drips. Some things are constant. The forbidden is always more tempting. The chamber grows quiet. The priest lifts a ladle, dips it into the first jar, and lets the beer stream slowly into a large communal bowl. The sound is hypnotic, thick liquid gurgling, bubbles popping softly. One jar emptied, then another, then another. The offender flinches at each splash, like coins clattering into a slot machine, except here the payout isn't his. You feel your shoulders loosen as the rhythm continues. Slosh, ladle, pour. The priests hum quietly, maybe prayers, maybe just the ancient equivalent of small talk. The chamber feels timeless, suspended in the cycle of offense, fine and restitution. You let your head tilt, eyes heavy, wondering if this endless procession of jars could just go on forever. And in some sense, it does. The clay tablets outlast the beer, outlast the priests, outlast the offenders themselves. But the pattern remains. Mistakes made, jars hauled, beer poured, balance restored. It's not glamorous, not bloody, not cinematic, but it's justice, Sumerian style. A little boring, a little sticky, but steady enough to lull you into a drowsy half smile. The temple courtyard hums with flies, the sweet tang of spilled beer drawing them like worshippers of their own tiny religion. You drift deeper into the complex, past columns daubed with soot, into a chamber where the air feels cooler, heavier, more solemn. Here, the beer is not just currency or punishment, it is holy ritual. Priests move like shadows, linen robes brushing across stone, their voices low and echoing. At the center of the chamber, a wide basin sits carved from stone, its rim darkened by countless libations. Jars of beer are stacked nearby, their clay damp with condensation, their stoppers sealed with reed plugs. 2 men kneel before the priests, locked in a land dispute. Their arguments echo softly, but instead of bickering, they bow their heads as the priest gestures toward the jars. Mainstream fact: Sumerian temples often served as both religious sanctuaries and courts of law. Priests acted not only as intermediaries with the gods, but also as arbiters in civil matters. Justice here was inseparable from divine ritual, and beer, believed to be a gift from the goddess Ninkasi, was offered to the gods as part of sealing verdicts. The quirky tidbit: some surviving records suggest that purity tests were performed using beer. If an accused person refused to drink from the communal pot, or if they spilled it clumsily, it could be taken as a sign of guilt. In other words, your fate might hinge on how gracefully you sipped. Picture modern courtrooms where the judge slides a pint across the bench and says, "If you choke on this, you're guilty." Not the fairest system, but certainly memorable. The priest lifts a ladle, dipping it into the basin. He fills a small cup and offers it first to one disputant, then the other. Both sip, their faces tightening as the bitter, yeasty brew hits their tongues. They pass the cup back, and the priest pours the remainder into the basin, murmuring prayers to Ninkasi and Enki. The onlookers nod, convinced the gods now witness the agreement. Historians still argue whether these rituals were binding contracts or symbolic gestures meant to appease divine justice. Was the beer literally consumed as proof of honesty, or was the offering to the gods the true seal of the bargain? The tablets record fines, yes, but the ritual layer remains harder to pin down. Maybe both mattered, the gods as silent witnesses, the beer as tangible proof. You stand quietly in the shadows, watching the two men clasp hands after the ritual. The dispute, muddy canals, barley fields, water rights, isn't erased, but it feels lighter now, smoothed over by shared drink and divine presence. The priests gather the remaining jars, their faces unreadable, though you suspect they'll be the ones enjoying the surplus later. Priestly Perks, 2000 BCE edition. In the corner, a young novice struggles to balance a jar, nearly tipping it over. The priest scolds him sharply, reminding everyone that spilling beer before the gods is no minor clumsiness. It could be seen as an omen, a bad sign. You glance down and think of modern times. We still whisper about spilled salt, broken mirrors, unlucky black cats, superstition, sticky across centuries. The chamber grows quiet except for the steady drip of beer poured into the basin. The sound is hypnotic, like rainwater dripping into a barrel. You let your breathing slow to match it, your eyelids heavy, your mind softened by the repetition. In this space, disputes blur into ritual, human quarrels swallowed into divine ceremony. The two men rise, bow, and shuffle away, their sandals whispering against stone. The priests remain, serene, murmuring prayers, ladles glinting in the dim light, and you, still in the corner, feel yourself lulled by the idea that somewhere between human anger and divine patience lies a bowl of cloudy beer, quietly bubbling, quietly binding. The temple fades behind you, its cool stone chambers replaced once more by the dusty heat of the open fields. You trudge along an irrigation canal, the water sluggish and brown, dragonflies hovering lazily above it. Ahead, two farmers stand chest-deep in an argument, their voices slicing through the still air. You edge closer, curious, because if there's one thing you've learned in Sumer, no quarrel is too small to be measured in beer. Their dispute is classic. Whose canal stole more water, whose barley rows suffered more under the scorching sun, whose boundary stones shifted in the last flood. Both men jab their fingers toward the cracked earth, as though pointing at invisible lines only they can see. Neither looks ready to swing a hoe, but both look desperate to win. Mainstream fact, property disputes in ancient Sumer were incredibly common. With fields dependent on carefully managed irrigation, even a few inches of diverted water could mean the difference between a full harvest and famine. Clay tablets record dozens of quarrels over canals, boundaries, and flood damage. Here's the quirky twist. Instead of exchanging livestock or gold, farmers often compensated each other with beer casks at harvest time. Beer wasn't just payment. It was a way to acknowledge that one man's water had nourished another man's barley. Imagine settling a modern fence dispute by promising your neighbor 6-packs for the next 3 summers. Probably fewer lawsuits and definitely more barbecues. The argument before you builds like a summer storm, voices rising, arms flailing. Then comes the mediator, a wiry elder with a tablet under one arm and a stylus tucked into his belt. He listens, squints at the canal, then proposes the solution. One farmer must deliver 2 large jars of beer at the next harvest to the other. Not immediately, not in coin, but in drink, timed to when the barley turns golden again. Historians still argue whether these beer-based compensations were enforced by formal courts or handled entirely by local agreements. Were they scribbled down in official archives or just remembered over mugs until harvest came? Some tablets suggest formal contracts, while others hint at handshake deals sealed with a drink. The line between law and custom blurs like ink bleeding into wet clay. The farmers grumble, but they nod. One scratches his beard, the other kicks at the dust. A witness steps forward. Another neighbor, probably bribed with the promise of a share from those jars. He watches as the scribe marks down the terms, the stylus tapping like the steady beat of a drum. And just like that, the heat dissipates. The quarrel is still there, but muffled, dulled, wrapped in the slow promise of future beer. You watch the men trudge back to their fields, sweat darkening their tunics. The canal gurgles faintly, a reminder that the water will always spark fights. But the rhythm of resolution is strangely comforting. Argument, agreement, beer. Repeat forever. A breeze stirs, and for a moment you imagine yourself in their place, promising next season's drinks instead of filing endless paperwork. Maybe humanity hasn't really advanced. We've just replaced jars with banknotes, harvests with deadlines. Both systems equally capable of leaving you thirsty. The sun sinks lower, painting the barley fields gold, the same color as the beer that will settle today's quarrel months from now. You feel the edges of your mind soften again, lulled by the cycle. Disputes rise, but they always end in the same frothy place. The fields fall behind you, their stalks swaying in the twilight, and soon the hum of the village wraps around you again. Tonight, though, the mood feels different, quieter, almost ceremonial. You follow the sound of pipes and laughter until you stumble into a courtyard strung with reed mats. Torches flicker, casting long shadows over garlands of flowers and clay jars stacked neatly against the wall. You've walked into a wedding feast, and you already know what the centerpiece of every promise, every celebration, and every argument will be: beer. At the head of the courtyard, the bride and groom sit side by side, their hands linked loosely. A scribe hovers nearby, tablet ready, not to record vows about love or loyalty, but about obligations, dowries, exchanges, and, you guessed it, jars of beer. You inch closer and catch the stylus scratching. The groom provides 3 jars of beer monthly to the bride's household, In the event of separation, each party returns equal shares of the jars remaining. Not quite Shakespearean romance, but undeniably practical. Mainstream fact: Sumerian marriage contracts often involved detailed economic agreements, and beer was frequently part of them. These weren't sentimental documents. They outlined duties, resources, and what each family gained. Beer rations could symbolize prosperity, stability, and the husband's ability to provide. The quirky tidbit: divorce, too, was marked by beer. Some tablets record settlements where one spouse compensated the other with jars of beer, almost like saying, "Sorry it didn't work out. Here's a six-pack for your trouble." Imagine modern divorce courts. Instead of splitting assets, the judge announces, "Each of you walks away with equal shares of the craft brews." Civilized? Maybe. Messy? Definitely. The courtyard buzzes with energy as musicians play, children dart between legs, and servants pour beer into wide communal bowls. Guests dip reed straws in, sipping the cloudy brew in unison. But amid the revelry, the legal side lingers in the background. The scribe's tablet will be baked tomorrow, forever enshrining the bride and groom's mutual obligations, not in rings, but in barley rations. Historians still argue whether beer in marriage contracts symbolized literal consumption or broader wealth. Was it about drinking together, or about showing that households could sustain themselves? Maybe both. Shared beer as both sustenance and bond. You glance toward a corner where a couple argues quietly. Divorce, apparently, has its place at weddings, too. A woman gestures angrily at her husband, demanding the return of beer jars she claims were hers before marriage. The husband shakes his head, his tunic stained from spilled drink, his face flushed. The scribe listens patiently, as though he's seen this dance 100 times. Perhaps another clay shard will soon bear the record of their separation. You sip the air thick with yeast and smoke and imagine your own life contracts written in beer. 1 jar weekly in exchange for doing the laundry, 2 jars monthly for taking out the trash. Honestly, it might make chores more tolerable. The night grows deeper, and the wedding guests sway like reeds in the wind, their laughter softened by cloudy drink. The bride and groom smile faintly, their hands still joined, their future sealed by both ritual and contract. You feel a pang of tenderness, buried beneath all the clay and clauses. These people loved, fought, and reconciled in the same messy, foamy ways we still do, just with more styluses involved. The torches flicker lower, the music slows, and the scribe tucks away his damp clay, the day's vows etched forever. You let your eyelids sink, comforted by the sleepy thought that even love and heartbreak once flowed through jars of beer. The wedding torches sputter out behind you, leaving only the hum of crickets and the faint tang of yeast on the breeze. You drift through the narrow streets, guided now by the glow of another gathering. Voices rise and fall, laughter tumbling into slurred arguments, and as you edge closer, you realize you've stumbled into a late-night hearing. Not in a temple, not in a tidy courtyard, but right here under the stars, half trial, half drinking session. The witnesses lean on clay jars, their cheeks ruddy, their words spilling out as fast as the beer they keep sloshing into bowls. A scribe sits in the middle of it all, stylus poised, struggling to keep a straight face as men argue through hiccups and belches. One man waves his straw like a weapon, swearing he saw his neighbor steal a goat. Another interrupts, slurring that, no, actually, the goat walked off on its own, probably to join another herd. Mainstream fact. Ancient Sumerian trials often relied on witnesses whose testimonies were recorded on clay tablets. Their words carried weight, and multiple witnesses could make or break a case. The quirky tidbit: some records hint that these witnesses weren't always sober. Beer flowed freely at legal gatherings, and scribes had to write down what was said, even if it came out half-garbled. Imagine courtroom transcripts today reading, Your Honor, I saw the sheep fly over the canal. It wouldn't hold up in appeals court, but in Sumer, maybe it was good enough. One witness hiccups so violently he nearly knocks over the jar beside him. Foam dribbles down his beard as he tries again. I swear, on Ninkasi herself, the goat was tied to the wrong post. The crowd bursts into laughter, except the accuser, who fumes, insisting the testimony proves his point. The scribe's stylus wobbles as he scratches the words, probably wondering if future readers will take any of this seriously. Historians still argue how much weight drunken testimony really held. Were these witnesses humored, or did the community genuinely accept beer-lubricated truth as valid? The tablets record their words without commentary, leaving us unsure whether scribes suppressed a chuckle or sighed in exasperation. You shift, amused, as another man stumbles forward to add his account. He gestures so wildly that he spills beer onto the tablet itself, smearing the fresh wedges. The scribe groans, wiping it clean as best he can, then resumes. Somewhere down the centuries, archaeologists will puzzle over faint stains, never guessing they came from a witness too tipsy to aim his straw. The trial drifts, as all things here do, into a muddle of laughter and sloshing. The accuser softens. The accused offers an extra jar of beer as compromise, and soon the goat seems forgotten. Instead, witnesses raise their bowls in a toast, sealing the verdict not with signatures, but with a clink of clay. You lean back against the wall, watching the stars above blur into the flicker of torches. Justice tonight feels less like punishment and more like a neighborhood party, messy, noisy, a little absurd, and yet it works. Anger fizzles into chuckles, verdicts dissolve into shared drink, and by the end, everyone stumbles home lighter, if not entirely satisfied. Your eyes close for a moment. The scratch of the stylus, the gurgle of beer, the drone of voices, they fuse into a kind of lullaby. Even chaos, you realize, can be strangely soothing when wrapped in cloudy brew and sleepy laughter. The laughter fades into the night, and you wander further until the streets grow wider, more orderly. Mud brick houses give way to larger courtyards and the looming shadow of a ziggurat in the distance. Here, the voices you hear are not drunken slurs, but the booming proclamations of authority. A crier's chant carries across the plaza, punctuated by the dull thud of a staff on stone. Tonight, you've walked right into the sound of a king laying down laws, and unsurprisingly, beer takes center stage once again. A clay tablet is held aloft for all to see, its surface freshly carved with neat lines. The decree is simple enough. Tavern keepers must pour honestly. No watering down, no short measures. If they cheat their customers, punishment awaits. The crowd murmurs, nodding. Beer is too vital to mess with, too sacred, too central to life. Mainstream fact, rulers like Hammurabi, though technically later than early Sumerians, issued detailed laws regulating beer. These included penalties for tavern keepers who overcharged or watered down the drink, since beer was a staple of daily nutrition as much as a pleasure. The quirky tidbit: some laws prescribed shockingly harsh punishments for dishonest beer sellers, including drowning. Yes, drowning for watering down beer. That's cosmic irony, being punished with the very element you added. Imagine modern health inspectors wielding that kind of authority. Your latte has too much foam, sir. Into the river with you. You edge closer and watch the king's attendants act out a little demonstration, showing how tavern keepers must use standard measures carved from clay to pour. One assistant tips a jar, filling exactly the approved vessel, then holding it up to cheers. Fairness, measured in frothy gulps. Historians still argue whether these laws were consistently enforced or mostly symbolic. Were tavern keepers dragged off to watery fates every week? Or was the threat more like a scarecrow, rarely tested but always looming? The truth probably floated somewhere in between, like foam on a pint. The crier continues, his chant rising like the call of a market vendor. Let no innkeeper take silver unfairly. Let no brewer deceive with weak beer. The words ripple through the crowd, part warning, part reassurance. People nod, some chuckle nervously, others glance toward the nearest tavern with a hint of suspicion. You can almost hear them thinking, maybe I should start measuring my drinks more carefully. As the decree ends, a group of children giggle, pretending to be tavern keepers caught cheating. One pours imaginary beer into a cracked bowl, another shouts, "Too much water," before dragging the culprit toward a pretend river. Even play carries echoes of law here. The king's scribes press the wet clay tablets into baskets, ready to be dried and stored. They will outlast the night, the year, and maybe even the kingdom, etched forever with the reminder that fairness in beer is not just about taste, but about justice itself. You lean against a wall, smiling faintly. In your world, rules about beer might be scribbled on a bar sign. No outside drinks, tip your server. But here, they're inscribed as eternal law. Beer isn't just social lubrication. It's a foundation of order, guarded by kings with all the solemnity of divine command. The plaza empties slowly, people muttering about fair measures as they shuffle home. The torches burn lower, and you find yourself staring at the clay decree, its sharp lines gleaming in the flicker. Justice, discipline, punishment, all wrapped around something so ordinary, so human, as wanting your drink poured honestly. You breathe in the dusty night, eyelids heavier now. Kings and laws fade into the hum of crickets, leaving behind only the faint comfort that even in the strictest codes, people still cared most about the simple fairness of a full jar. The echo of the king's proclamations fades behind you as you wander into the narrow lanes again. This time, The glow spilling out of mud brick walls feels softer, warmer, less like a courtroom, more like a hearth. You pause, leaning against a post, as the sound of chatter and clinking bowls drifts out. Inside, you glimpse women running taverns with a confidence that seems to steady the whole block. Their sleeves are rolled up, their voices sharp, their laughter louder than most of the men's. In this corner of Sumer, women innkeepers hold surprising sway. They control the flow of beer, which means they control the mood, the trust, and sometimes even the verdict. You slip inside one of these taverns and watch the bustle unfold. A farmer argues with a merchant over a debt, voices raised but kept in check by the stern glance of the woman behind the counter. She pours bowls for each, sliding them across the table. Drink first, argue after, her eyes seem to say. Mainstream fact: taverns in Mesopotamia were often run by women. Ancient texts even refer to alewives, female innkeepers whose establishments doubled as gathering places, transaction sites, and yes, informal courts. The quirky tidbit, one of the earliest surviving laws written into Hammurabi's code, specifies punishment for tavern keepers who failed to report criminal activity overheard in their establishments. In other words, these women were not just pouring beer, they were expected to serve as neighborhood spies, too. Imagine your local bartender being legally required to turn in gossip to the police. You watch the innkeeper in front of you arbitrate with barely more than a raised eyebrow. The two disputants squirm under her stare. She refills their bowls, slower this time, letting the silence do the work. Finally, the farmer sighs and offers to pay half the grain he owes now, the rest after harvest. The merchant grumbles, but nods. The innkeeper smiles faintly, satisfied. Another case closed without clay tablets or guards, just bowls of foamy justice. Historians still argue whether these women were truly empowered community leaders or simply tolerated because of their connection to beer, which no one could do without. Were they respected figures, or were they exploited middlemen for men's disputes? The texts leave us half answers, teasing glimpses of women who stood at the hinge of household and law. One woman calls across the room, teasing a group of younger men. They protest that their beer is weak. With mock outrage, she strides over, dips her ladle deep, and fills their bowls so full they splash onto their tunics. The room bursts into laughter, the kind that makes quarrels impossible. You notice how quickly tension vanishes here under her command. She is both host and judge, both motherly and sharp, turning beer into a tool of peace. You sip your imaginary bowl and watch her move, a figure who commands respect with every step. She knows everyone's names, everyone's debts, everyone's grudges, and somehow keeps them all from boiling over. Her tavern is less courtroom, less temple, and more like a place where society actually sticks together. Outside, the streets are dark, but her doorway glows, a kind of anchor for the neighborhood. Inside, disputes resolve, laughter echoes, and even the angriest men soften under her gaze. You realize these women weren't just pouring beer. They were pouring order, trust, and something like community. Your eyes linger on the doorway as you step back into the night. The warmth trails after you like a blanket, and the thought remains. Justice doesn't always come from kings or priests. Sometimes it comes from the hand that fills your cup just enough to remind you that life goes better when shared. The tavern door swings shut behind you, leaving a trail of warmth and laughter as you step back into the cool Mesopotamian night. The air carries a faint sweetness, the scent of brewing barley, honeyed yeast, and something smoke-tinged rising from temple fires further down the avenue. You drift toward the ziggurat, its tiers looming against the star-spotted sky, and soon you're surrounded by worshippers carrying jars of beer as offerings. Here, justice takes a different form, one aimed higher than kings or innkeepers, the gods themselves. At the temple courtyard, you watch men and women approach the priests, presenting clay jars filled with foaming drink. These aren't just casual donations, they are petitions. Each jar speaks a request. Settle my quarrel with my neighbor. Grant me favor in a trial. Wash away my broken promise. The priests pour a little of each offering onto the earth, letting the froth seep into dust as a gift to the divine. Mainstream fact, beer wasn't just daily sustenance in Sumer, it had a sacred role. Libations of beer were routinely poured to the gods during rituals, especially in temples dedicated to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, or Inanna, the goddess of love and justice. Disputes could be ritually sealed or healed with shared beer in these sacred spaces. The quirky tidbit: some texts suggest that during certain festivals, priests consumed massive quantities of beer as part of ritual performance, an almost comical display of piety. Imagine your local judge insisting on downing 10 pints before making a ruling in the name of justice. The line between devotion and tipsiness must have been thin indeed. You linger near the altar as two farmers arrive, each clutching a jar. Their dispute, overheard in murmured fragments, is over boundary stones washed away by last season's flood. They present their jars side by side. The priest nods, pours a portion from each into a shared bowl, and offers it back to them. Both men sip, awkward but obedient, and then clasp hands. The gods, they believe, have tasted first. Their quarrel is settled. Historians still argue whether this ritual sharing of beer was legally binding or simply symbolic, a kind of spiritual handshake. Did priests wield enforceable authority in property matters, or did they simply calm tempers so disputes didn't spill into violence? Clay tablets show records of both sacred and secular courts, leaving scholars to debate where the divine ended and the legal began. The crowd sways as chants rise, deep and slow, punctuated by the rhythmic clink of bowls. A young priestess walks by carrying a tray of small cups, offering them to select supplicants. Each sip is a reminder that justice isn't always about punishment. It's about reconciliation, balance, and acknowledging something greater than personal pride. You smile faintly, imagining modern courtrooms adopting such rituals. Picture it: two lawyers presenting six-packs to the judge, who solemnly cracks open the cans and pours a libation onto the carpet before handing the rest back to the feuding parties. Case dismissed. Cheers. Silly as it sounds, you realize the impulse isn't far from human truth. Sharing a drink can dissolve anger faster than any statute. The night deepens, torches flicker along the temple walls, and smoke curls upward in lazy ribbons. The ziggurat looms like a staircase to the stars, each step lined with offerings of grain, oil, and, most of all, beer. As the chants soften, you feel your body relax, as though the gods themselves are coaxing you into calm. You wander away slowly, the murmurs fading, carrying with you the sense that justice here isn't confined to clay tablets or royal decrees. It bubbles in shared bowls, in ritual libations, in the belief that peace flows more easily when the gods sip first. The torches of the temple fade behind you as you slip back into the bustle of the city. Night in Sumer is never truly silent. Donkeys bray in distant courtyards, dogs bark at shadows, and the hum of brewing kettles seems to seep from every alley. Your path leads you toward the market quarter, where disputes don't revolve around sacred vows or neighborly landlines, but around the oldest human pastime, cheating for profit. And in Sumer, the weapon of choice for a good scam is beer. You pause at a stall where a merchant pours out frothy mugs. The liquid looks rich enough, but the crowd murmurs with suspicion. A woman sniffs her drink, frowns, and mutters about watered-down ale. Soon, voices rise, accusations of dishonesty bouncing from one clay wall to the next. You lean closer and catch the word scam, spoken in tones as ancient as the stone beneath your sandals. Mainstream fact: records on clay tablets preserve complaints from customers against tavern keepers and merchants accused of diluting beer or shorting measures. Hammurabi's code even dictated that tavern keepers who overcharged or cheated patrons faced punishment, since beer wasn't just leisure, it was currency and livelihood. Quirky tidbit: some surviving accounts describe angry customers dragging a dishonest seller before officials, beer jar in hand as evidence. Imagine the world's earliest consumer protection case, complete with Exhibit A sloshing around in a clay pot. Somewhere in a dusty corner, the world's first bad Yelp review was etched in cuneiform. You watch as a bearded merchant tries to defend himself, holding up his ladle as though it were a holy relic. He swears the barley was weak this season, the water heavy, the gods uncooperative. His excuses spill out like thin beer, failing to satisfy the crowd. A witness steps forward, wiping foam from his beard, and declares the taste unfit for a goat. The tavern erupts in laughter, though the merchant is pale with fear. Historians still argue whether punishments for watered beer were consistently enforced or mostly symbolic threats. Some tablets suggest harsh fines, even death, while others hint that merchants often escaped with little more than a warning. Was justice strict or selective? The truth is lost in the haze of inconsistent records. The crowd grows restless, but before chaos breaks out, an official arrives, stern-faced, with a reed stylus tucked behind his ear. He listens, samples the beer himself, and grimaces theatrically. The verdict? The merchant must provide 2 jars of proper ale to every wronged customer, free of charge. The crowd cheers, bowls are held out eagerly, and the merchant slumps in defeat. As you watch the punishment unfold, you can't help but chuckle at how familiar it all feels. People today still grumble about weak drinks at overpriced bars. Some things never change. If you squint, You can almost see a line of clay tablets marked with little stars, like ancient customer ratings. Beer tasted like river water, would not recommend. The night air cools as the last mugs are filled, and the crowd disperses in good humor, leaving the chastened merchant to brood over his losses. You linger thinking about how even scams and scandals have their place in the story of justice. They remind everyone that fairness isn't just about lofty laws or divine rituals, it's about everyday honesty in every sip. And in Sumer, even watered beer had a way of making noise loud enough to echo through history. You wander away from the marketplace, the memory of the chastened beer merchant fading behind you. The streets grow quieter now, the hum of daily quarrels replaced by the distant pulse of drums. Ahead, you notice a caravan creaking its way toward the city gates. Donkeys plod under heavy sacks, drivers sing softly to keep rhythm, and strapped to the side of one wagon are clay jars sealed with pitch. They glisten faintly in the moonlight. Beer, not for taverns this time, but for something much bigger. Your feet follow the caravan as if curiosity tethers you. Outside the walls, a small camp of soldiers and emissaries gathers. Fires crackle, sending sparks into the sky, while nervous chatter fills the night air. The jars of beer are unloaded, lined up with ceremonial care, and suddenly you realize what's unfolding. Not a feast, not a trade sale, but diplomacy. Tonight, jars of beer will do what swords cannot: ease the tension between rival city-states. Mainstream fact: beer shipments were indeed used as diplomatic gifts in ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeological finds and administrative tablets record beer rations sent not only to workers and priests, but also to foreign emissaries, smoothing relations and honoring guests. Offering drink was a universal gesture of goodwill, bridging gaps between warring or competing groups. Quirky tidbit: some tablets even note absurdly specific rations, like 30 jugs of fine dark beer for the envoy of Lagash. Ah, imagine being the poor scribe assigned to tally that, grumbling about drunk dignitaries while scratching numbers into wet clay. One imagines a scene not unlike modern diplomats smiling stiffly over glasses of champagne, except with frothier beards and heavier clay mugs. You step closer to the gathering as two leaders meet. Their robes shimmer faintly with embroidered patterns, though the stiffness in their shoulders betrays suspicion. Soldiers stand ready, hands on spears, but no one dares move. Then the first jar is cracked open with a hollow pop, and a priest pours a measure into 2 bowls. The leaders sip, eyes narrowing over the rims. A long pause, then a smile, small at first, then growing. More jars are opened, more bowls passed around, and soon the soldiers are laughing, clinking mugs like brothers instead of enemies. Historians still argue whether such ceremonies genuinely prevented wars or merely delayed them. Some suggest that these beer feasts were symbolic, meant to buy time for real negotiations carried out elsewhere. Others claim that, at least on occasion, beer truly tipped the balance, turning hostility into hesitant friendship. Without video evidence, unless someone invents a time-traveling livestream, we'll never know. You settle by a fire as the night stretches on. The jars grow lighter, the laughter louder. A scribe dutifully notes each gift exchanged: grain, oil, and of course, beer. You imagine him sighing tomorrow when his clay tablet smudges from all the spilled froth. But for now, the mood is unmistakable. Peace, at least for one night, bought not with armies, but with barley. It's hard not to see the echo in modern times. How many leaders have toasted treaties with wine or whiskey? Swap the crystal glasses for clay mugs, and the script remains the same. Humanity trying, awkwardly, to be civil over a shared drink. You chuckle, picturing a UN summit where world leaders haul in kegs and foam-tipped mugs instead of bottled water. Global peace through happy hour has a certain ring, doesn't it? The fires burn lower, shadows stretch long, and the air cools. Around you, the tension has melted into easy conversation. Soldiers swap stories instead of threats. Emissaries sing instead of argue. You sense, perhaps, that the gods themselves are amused, watching from above as humans trade war for beer, at least for a fleeting moment. The fires from that diplomatic camp still flicker in your memory as you drift forward through the centuries. You leave the donkeys, the clay tablets, and the quarrelsome neighbors behind. The air feels lighter now, as if history itself is easing its grip, and you find yourself standing in a quiet tavern, not in Ur or Lagash, but in your own time. A bartender wipes down a counter, glasses clink in the background, and the amber glow of a half-finished pint shimmers in front of you. You tilt the glass, watching the foam rise and fall. Suddenly, you can almost hear those Sumerian voices layered beneath the chatter of the modern bar. Farmers arguing over fields. Merchants pleading innocence about watered beer. Kings dictating rules about tavern keepers. Priests solemnly passing around bowls. And most of all, the countless ordinary people who once leaned over mugs just like this one, trying to sort out the messy business of living together. Mainstream fact. Archaeologists trace beer's roots not only to Sumer, but to its continued role across millennia, as wages, as offerings, and as the foundation of countless legal and social rituals. From Egyptian builders to medieval monks, beer kept its place as both refreshment and rule enforcer. Quirky tidbit. In some cases, beer even outlived the laws it supported. Scholars have found references to extinct barley varieties once prized for legal beer, lost crops that can only be guessed at through residue analysis. Imagine someday cloning a 6,000-year-old beer recipe just to settle a parking ticket. Historians still argue whether Sumerians truly invented beer or simply perfected earlier brewing techniques. But regardless of origin, one truth remains. They were the first to write about it, the first to tax it, and the first to weaponize it for justice. You sip your drink, thinking about how fragile and strange that is, that something as simple as a foamy brew could carry the weight of contracts, fines, and peace treaties. Today, beer is just a casual pleasure, a background hum at ball games, a weekend ritual with friends. Yet, every time someone raises a glass, some faint echo of those Sumerian taverns lingers. The laughter, the quarrels, the stylus scratching in clay, it all bubbles up in each pint, like a memory you didn't know you had. You realize, perhaps with a little smile, that you are part of the same story. Different time, different language, different mug, but the same human impulse to sit together, share a drink, and smooth over the rough edges of life. And maybe, just maybe, the world could still learn from that. The wind down begins now, slower, softer. Your glass grows heavy in your hand, and the tavern lights dim. The noises around you blur into a low, comforting hum. Each sound seems to stretch longer, the spaces between words widening until everything feels slow, almost dreamlike. You let your shoulders sink, the tension drifting away. In your mind's eye, the noisy Sumerian marketplace quiets, the clamor of disputes fading into silence. The clay tablets crumble back into dust, their cuneiform scratches smoothing into soft earth. The jars of beer settle under layers of sand, sealed and forgotten, waiting patiently in the dark. Your breath steadies, matching the rhythm of some ancient lullaby whispered by the tigress. The warmth of the drink lingers, but now it is only comfort, not obligation. You picture a long table stretching across time itself, filled with faces from every era, mugs raised not in anger, but in peace. Everyone laughing gently, no debts, no quarrels, no judgments left unresolved, just rest. The light flickers once more, then fades. You are safe, you are calm. The stories have settled, the dust has settled, and so have you. So close your eyes, let the weight of history drift away, and sleep easy. Somewhere far back in the cradle of civilization, the Sumerians have already poured the last drink for tonight. Sweet dreams,